Hello, I'm Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome to another in our series of double shot interviews where we bring in a minister or a CEO or an academic or someone talking about the things we care about, which is economics, finance, property, whatever. And one of the big topics that we talk about a lot is the brain drain, the loss of New Zealand's skills overseas, and of course migrants coming back in. And luckily enough, we've got John Gibson here. He's an economist from the Department of Economics at the University of Waikato. He's just written a paper that's been published in various places, including Vox EU, about the brain drain. So we thought we'd get John in to have a chat, particularly because in our office at interest.co, we've got a working case study of brain drain and reverse. So the 3 New Zealand-born people in our office have actually worked overseas and come back, and then we've got a couple of foreign-born people who have migrated to New Zealand. When we all assume that a brain drain is a bad idea, your research has looked at this. What do you find?
It's, on balance, very strongly positive for the countries which are large sources of skilled labour moving abroad. And those countries are predominantly small island countries, and in that regard New Zealand is not different than developing countries because their smallness and having a large neighbour with much larger urban areas and much higher wage rates in those urban areas in Australia with fairly free mobility makes us not much different than the Caribbean with respect to the US, or the Pacific with respect to New Zealand and Australia. Auckland and Sydney are both large for those people, or Africa with respect to either the UK, Europe or the US.
So how does New Zealand benefit when people leave?
Well, we have to kind of make a distinction between New Zealand and New Zealanders, because when people leave, people are earning, we show quite large gains, up to $50,000 per year, US. Average earnings are higher abroad. So these are very large gains for New Zealanders, and they don't suddenly stop being New Zealanders when they go out the door. One of the issues is, how do the left behind folks benefit? In less developed countries, they have mechanisms which we really don't have for that, which is people send money, right? Remittances. So they run a fairly lean public service. They run a fairly low tax rate. They run a high consumption tax and a low income tax, and then remittances are very large, and it's almost neutral in terms of public finance for whether the people would have stayed there, earned at a lower rate and contributed taxes, or been abroad and earned at a much higher rate. Sending remittances, the migrants themselves are better off. People left behind are also, on balance, about equal.
But I can't imagine that New Zealanders living in London or Sydney are actually sending remittances back to New Zealand.
There's some, but not much, and we're clearly not at the rate of the other countries. And so this is the awkward issue for a country like New Zealand. We've got progressive taxation, so the highly skilled would be contributing disproportionately to fiscal revenues going forward. They're not there. Now, it's arguable that they would also be getting quite large shares of public expenditure as well, but probably not as much as their contribution to income. So we've got a loss there, but the size of that loss in the New Zealand case is about $14,000 to $15,000 per year, compared with the gains to the migrants themselves of about $50,000. And so that one-off gain outweighs any of the other factors. There's a little bit of trade and investment. There's a little bit of facilitation of exports from the country, but most of the stories like that, which are much more told about, say, China and India and Silicon Valley and Bangalore and in Taiwan and so forth, those are exceptional. Those are unusual stories because those countries are particularly large and have large domestic markets or skilled workforces. But the typical country sending a lot of people abroad is much more like New Zealand or like the Pacific or the Caribbean, and so there's not too much of a domestic market effect going on.
But is there a benefit when people come back with all sorts of skills and contacts and build new businesses?
Not as much as is often thought. What we find if we look at New Zealand and our group of very, very highly skilled people, Duxers and people who get into the New Zealand Herald in January as the top scholars throughout the country and so forth, going back for a 30-year period. So most of them, the oldest groups are about 50 or so, and so we've got people from early 20s through to early 50s. At around about the late 20s, more than half of them are abroad. But by age 40, it's a fairly equal three-way split. And so 1/3 are like your office, people who've been abroad, worked abroad, studied abroad and come back. 1/3 have never gone abroad for work or study, so they've holidayed and things like that, obviously, and 1/3 are abroad and possibly won't be coming back. The big predictors of not coming back are marrying someone who's from another country and also getting a PhD. Because it's more specialised labour markets and there's not too many opportunities in countries like New Zealand for people like that.
Because there's a lot of gnashing of teeth and debate about how we get New Zealanders home. Should we try to get them home? How do we stop people from leaving? I mean, how does all this fit into the policy debate?
So we actually don't find returnees to be massively more productive, at least in market work, than people who never left but came from the same skilled category. And so in trying to attract people back through manipulating taxes or immediately after the recession, I remember David Skilling had some plan to do a raid on foreign talent and bring them back. The big problem is that the size of the income gaps are so large that there's nothing that could feasibly be done to close those. Now, this is not meant to be defeatist. It's not saying we should tolerate lower incomes, but it does say that the opportunities for skilled workers in international cities are so much more remunerative than we can offer in New Zealand that the reasons that people are coming back are almost always non-economic. Their family, their children's lifestyle, they're growing up, some of them are cultural and environmental, and so those are not things which public policy typically can do too much about.
So how do we raise the total output, if you like, and try to either maximise the number of people leaving, minimise the number of people leaving, maximise the number of people coming back? How do we arrange things so that we do the best we can?
Well, or there's another option you didn't list as well, which is to get the most value out of the ones who are abroad, to recognise that many of them are abroad for reasons entirely not to do with New Zealand. And so, student loans is a good example. So people said, the student loan scheme is driving people overseas, and if we make it interest-free and do all sorts of write-offs, it'll bring them back. It hasn't worked at all. And the reality is that the income gains are so large, the average student loan is quite small, and so that's not really a big thing pushing people away. And I know the student unions have done a good job of convincing the public it is, but truly it's not. So better would be to say, well, given that we've got a large diaspora abroad, how can we get real value for money out of them? And surprisingly, we don't find the government, we don't find a lot of New Zealand companies that tap into that external network. I'll give an example in my area. In the funding of research in New Zealand, we have something called the Marsden Fund, which is the premier source of science funds. It will fund people based in New Zealand. It won't fund overseas people. Now, obviously, they don't want to have the local market overwhelmed by US-based researchers, let's say. But you might say, what if you had people overseas who had an undergraduate degree from New Zealand? Do we consider those still part of the greater New Zealand? And so there's a model of development for this strange country, which has got a very high proportion of its skilled population abroad, which is not going to be the same one where development occurs within the land boundary is the only thing we're interested in. We're interested in New Zealanders everywhere, and we're interested in tapping in to those skills and those knowledges. And at the moment, I don't think we've organised our policies and our thinkings in ways that take account of that.
Is there evidence to suggest we should be trying to stop people from leaving?
Stopping people from leaving, if we take that to the extreme cases, the North Koreas and that, we know is a terrible policy for both for the welfare of people themselves, but for the countries. There may well be reasons to think about ways in which we could get more value for money out of people who are going to leave anyway. Right? So if we admit that, irrespective of local policies, a lot of people are going to leave just because of the earnings frontiers out in major world cities. It wouldn't be the silliest idea to change the way that we fund tertiary education. It wouldn't be the silliest idea to say that having a student loan scheme which runs through the IRD makes sense if you've got people in this tax net or this tax locality, but maybe it shouldn't be run that way at all. Perhaps the whole student loan book should be sold to HSBC or some international bank, which will get repayments no matter where in the world people are. Perhaps the cost of tertiary education should be increased quite dramatically for individuals, because that's one of the few things which one could put in place as sort of like a leaving tax. And why would we want to do that? Well, it might be that this was our what I would call our stake in God's lottery. The distribution of skilled people across the world. And lots of skilled people never get the opportunity to fulfill their skills because they grow up in poor countries and so forth. And luckily for most New Zealanders, we're a rich enough country that they can fulfill their skills. But when they leave, if there's not going to be a flow of remittances or anything like that, and there's not a huge trade creation or investment boost, then maybe we need to think about some other way. And one other way would be to make the ticket out, which is typically tertiary education, make that more expensive. Mix up the sector a little bit, privatise some of the universities, have a much more diverse way of getting hold of those people for that limited period.
Interesting. Thank you very much. John Gibson, there from the Department of Economics at the University of Waikato. He's co-written a paper with David McKenzie, who's working with the World Bank. We'll have links to that paper underneath, and all the details there about the research and how it was done and the exact results are there. And of course, we welcome your comments on this issue of the brain drain and what we could do about it, should do about it. There we have it, another double shot interview. I'm Bernard Hickey for interest.co.nz.